There have been altogether too many wars in history. One would think people would get the idea and learn from the mistakes that were made by the previous generations. Instead, like the Israelites during the time of the Judges, people seem to repeat the same errors a couple centuries after they were made the first time. In the case of World War II, it was only a couple decades after the war to end all wars that all of Europe was at it again. In the modern age, we have all of history at our disposal. Can you imagine how wise we could be as a people if we chose to use this accumulated knowledge for our benefit? That's why rather than just knowing what happened in history and who was involved, I think it's so important to understand why it happened and how we can repeat or prevent it in the future accordingly. That's why God gave us the gift of history, and that's why I've chosen to speak on the causes of World War II. I think it's generally natural for people to look at conflicts in history like one would a superhero movie, where you have the good side who you root for, and the bad side whose every move must be horrendous. In reality, is that the way people's hearts work? Do you have the good people and then the bad people? I'm not downplaying the wickedness of the causes of the Axis powers during World War II. Many of them were controlled by cruel, evil men with extremely wrong agendas. What I am saying is that one must wonder how whole nations could be so deceived as to fall prey willingly to such obviously corrupt leaders without a fight. It leads us to conclude that something must have been terribly wrong with their hearts. Unfortunately, in the case of World War II, this not only came from within, but also stemmed from the hate and unforgiveness shown Germany by the rest of the world in the aftermath of World War I. Thus, I would attribute World War II to three basic causes: international tensions, eager dictators, and spiritual depravity. First of all, bitterness and conflict among nations was one of the main factors in World War II, especially following World War I. World War I was basically a war fought because everyone was proud of their militaries and wanted to show them off. That's an overgeneralization, but it was a rather useless war. Still, for a great nation like Germany to be proved wrong and have her pride crushed was a humiliation. Germany should have been able to recover from these feelings of wounded pride, and she probably would have, except that the rest of the world decided to assert their victory and rub in Germany's loss. Many world leaders met for a peace conference at Versailles to discuss the Treaty of, guess what, Versailles. Germany was not invited. An ironic fact, since President Wilson meant to promote a peace among equals with the conference. Germany was not the sole cause for World War I. She was only one of several arrogant nations involved. Because she was one of the strongest nations in the world at that time, many thought she ought to be disabled. The Treaty of Versailles accomplished this by taking away almost all of her Air Force and Navy and all but 100,000 of her armed men. It also gave her rich territories of Alsace and Lorraine back to France, as well as the rights to one of her most productive industrial regions, the Saar Valley. She would surrender other areas to Poland and Denmark. But the most crushing blow for Germany was that she would have to admit all responsibility for World War I, a broad and unrealistic statement. She would also have to pay a $33 billion war debt to cover the costs for all the nations involved in the war. This ridiculous burden was too much for Germany, especially going into the Great Depression, and she was soon in economic ruins. Thousands of people would lose their jobs, many their homes, and some their lives. When Germany surrendered at the end of World War I, she accepted the terms of Wilson's 14 points, which seemed a fair way of restoring order to Germany and the rest of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles didn't abide by these guidelines, but Germany really didn't have any choice but to comply. If she did not, the rest of the world could send out their militaries and begin the war over again. So Germany consented, leaving her people hard-hearted and distrustful of the rest of the world. Probably the most obvious reason for World War II would be the many dictators who took advantage of Europe's political situation. It's rather difficult to think of World War II without seeing images of men like Hitler and Mussolini. It's curious how these dictators so easily established their power, but the political, financial, and spiritual situation in Europe was a breeding ground for corrupt policies. Socialism seemed to promise prosperity and equality for the common man, both of which sounded agreeable to ruined nations like Germany, and Hitler was a charismatic and shrewd individual who was attractive to the public. Hitler also called the Germans a master race that were racially superior to their neighbors and had a right to treat others as subordinate to themselves. This hideously self-centered reasoning obviously appeals to human pride, especially after it had been repressed for so long. Hitler used the distrust that was already brooding in Germany to launch brutal attacks against small people groups like the Gypsies and the Jews by convincing the Germans that these groups were out to get them and turning them against their neighbors. By 1934, Hitler had established himself as Darfur of Germany with his Third Reich. Benito Mussolini accomplished a similar feat about 12 years earlier with his fascism in Italy. Both of these dictators had almost unanimous support. The youth of Germany were especially enthusiastic about Hitler's new rule, and even the German church welcomed Hitler as their new head. A chilling and slightly nauseating statement from a German school textbook of the day read, "As Jesus set men free from sin and hell, so Hitler rescued the German people from destruction." Hitler also boldly defied the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He soon raised an army of 600,000 men, 6 times it was allotted to him. He also built up a strong air force and invaded the Rhineland, both of which were also illegal. But the people of Germany were delighted that their dictator would go to such great lengths to defend them. Soon Hitler's realm encompassed most of Europe as he swallowed up smaller nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia. Still, few people realized the threat that men like him could become until the war was already underway. No doubt the most important point to consider would be the spiritual emptiness of Europe at the time. The beginning of the 20th century, a new movement was sweeping the continent, the modernist movement. Modernism basically teaches that the Bible is an unreliable myth, that personal salvation isn't all that important, that man should just focus on bettering society to the best of his own ability. A futile attempt, of course. Modernism, also known as religious liberalism, is basically a fancy word for what man has been doing since the beginning, rejecting God and turning to himself. This open rejection of traditional biblical principles flung the door open for ideas like Darwinism and socialism to invade. I think we're all familiar with Darwinism. Darwin believed that the idea of a creator could be disposed of, and that given enough time, nature would alter itself in small ways to turn a simple creature, like a bacteria, into a complex creature, like man. With his lengthy explanations and convincing reasoning, Darwin managed to convince most of his society that his idea was scientific, even though it was based mainly on speculation and very little on actual scientific observation. Few people realize that Darwin's idea was actually the basis for most of Hitler's viewpoints on life. If man is really just another exalted animal, then his life is of not much more value than that of a rat. The idea that man is just another creature in the struggle for survival led to the false science of eugenics, which taught that by killing or preventing from reproduction those individuals or ethnic groups that seemed inferior to the others, a pure race could be developed that would somehow improve itself in the future. The atrocities and massacres of the Holocaust were largely due to this way of thinking. Socialism is another anti-biblical agenda. Socialism is basically the Robin Hood principle. The idea that government should take from the rich and give to the poor, and that in this way both pride on one hand and jealousy on the other would be abolished, since no individual would have more or less than another. This seemed like it would work. The main problem with it is that it relies on the false assumption that man is naturally good, and that if his circumstances are perfect, he will become perfect as well. We have found this to be untrue over the years, since all socialism produces is domineering dictators and lazy people who won't work if they won't get anything out of it. World War II and the Holocaust are examples of what happens when men lay aside the principles that God set in front of them from the beginning and leave him out of the picture. The progression leading up to World War II can be clearly seen as first pride and unforgiveness, then unawareness toward corruption in society, and finally downright spiritual rebellion. Disturbingly, we can see this same procession easily enough in American society today. There is rampant disunity, an overall apathy toward righteousness, and prevalent philosophies like atheism and evolution that attempt to dismiss God. Let's pray that by God's grace America will see how far she's fallen and turn around before she finds herself in another crisis situation, like World War II.